welcome to all of you. Delighted to have all of you here. I'm acting as host for a minute or so till we get going. And these are our Thursday afternoon speaker series in the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill. And one of those series is Culture, Mind, and Brain. And within Culture, Mind, and Brain, we're having a series of talks that come from, that are related to chapters in the book that just came out last week. So, and this will go on through next year, actually, interspersed with other culture, mind, and brain talks and other talks in other areas like global mental health or culture and community mental health and so on. And in fact, is it next week that we have Seinen speaking? I think it's next week, isn't it? Or am I wrong? Yes. So when we'll, if you're not on the, by now you should be on the mailing list. If you're not, let us know. We'll make sure you're all on the mailing list so you get these announcements. And please feel free to participate in any of these that interest you. I'm speaking mainly to the people here who are not already part of our local mailing list and network. We won't take time for everybody to introduce themselves because that would take up half the time. So, but feel free to write in the chat if you'd like anything about where you are and what you're doing and so on, because that's fun for other people. And one function of all these meetings always is a kind of networking and people being able to connect. So with that introduction, unless anybody else has any other announcements or things they want to mention, I will introduce our speaker for today very briefly because she'll tell us more. She told us something about herself last time as well, those of you who are following the series now. So I'm delighted to have Carol Worthman with us today, as she was last week. She's Samuel Kendler Dobbs Professor of Anthropology Emeritus at Emory University, where she has led a laboratory in comparative human biology in the Department of Anthropology for many years and been one of the founding figures of contemporary biosocial, biocultural anthropology that really tries to put together a deep understanding of human biology with all the marvelous things that we're learning in recent decades with a sensitivity to the cultural and social worlds that people live in. And it's that bringing together of these very, very different levels of knowledge or paradigms or interpenetrating kinds of disciplinary perspectives that really both characterizes her work, the work of her students, some of whom are with us today, different generations of contemporary anthropologists that she has nurtured. And Carol's been really seminal to the FPR and to this network and is now the scientific director of the network that is also, of which this book is one expression and our summer program is an expression and so on. So we're just absolutely delighted to have her here and for her to take us on a journey. She also advocated, we'll see how this goes, that those of us who are presenting on chapters in the book don't just simply rehearse what's in the chapter, but show where it's going or how our thinking has evolved and so on. And I think she's promised us a little bit of that today as well. So I'm delighted to welcome you, Carol, and I'll turn it over to you. I don't know if you need to be made you are co-host already, so you should be able to launch whatever you'd like. So.
Yeah, I'll share the screen. Thank you, Lawrence. And thanks for being here today, everyone. You can see the screen now, I hope?
Yep.
Okay. So, well, if ever anyone had something to say about a title for a chapter that was written a year ago, this would be the one. So being there has all kinds of different resonances now in the post-COVID era. And so I'm going, the first 2/3 of this talk, I'll talk about the main original argument, which had to do with the importance of where people are for who and how they are. So arguing for the importance of an ecological perspective and a diversity of methods for understanding human diversity. But then in the latter part, I'm going to talk about, sorry, I've learned the hard way that sometimes to get started, yeah, okay. That in the last third, going to take on the epistemological problem that actually neither my chapter nor the book itself really took on, and which we do touch on in the introduction for the third section. But this latter part is really going to be what I see as a work in progress for all of us, not just for me. So the first issue is this existential constraint. Everywhere you go, there you are, right? It's sort of circular that beings always and necessarily are somewhere. And so that insight has long been understood in terms of general ecology and adaptation, but actually it's in the last 10, 15 years that the evolutionary theory has really taken on a more deep understanding that the environments in which organisms live, even the simplest ones, are always co-constructions, that organisms are in there working on the environment right from the get-go. And so the expanded evolutionary synthesis takes that very seriously. And humans, of course, are the sort of masters of environmental modification and working through context. And so I'm going to run through some of the perspectives that arise out of that. And some of you who heard my talk a couple of years ago there will have seen this graphic where usually if we're looking at, can you see the arrow when I'm moving on the screen? Can you see it? Okay, great. Because the usual adaptationist perspective looks on the bio side, right, and says that organisms have characteristics, including behaviors, but physiology and so forth, that allow them to operate in the environment in which they live and deal with the selective pressures that are there. And their differential ability to do so determines how many long-term offspring they have, and that's going to drive gene frequencies, and there you get evolution. In the case of humans, we have a second stream, and this turns out not to be totally unique to humans, but we're going to really just focus on humans. Culture is sort of a catch-all word for that second stream of ways in which humans adapt the environments, create the environments in which they live. And so the dual stream of biology and culture inform human behavior and the context in which we live. And so that includes, our subsistence strategies, all the technologies that we use, the ways that we care for ourselves and each other, and a big one is always cooperation. So we have a whole chapter on cooperation in the book, and that's considered a big deal for humans. And it's this complex then that is considered to be our big deal for how we adapt in the world, and that has led to our perhaps two great success and the Anthropocene in terms of spreading all over the earth. However, the thing that often also gets left behind, and which is very important certainly for a biocultural perspective in understanding humans, is that this focus in the evolutionary perspective on genotype is really just looking at the shadow side of the real action, because selection operates on phenotype, right? And so looking at the production of phenotype is hugely important, and humans have a whole big complex for the production and maintenance of our phenotypes. And so I'm going to talk about a bit about this because this is where human development, which has been a bit focused for me, is important. But one thing to remember as we're thinking about development, because it's like, great, now we're pulling time in a different way, is that ecology is not just spatial, it's also temporal. And that organisms are living in multiple zones of temporality from the molecular on up through their own histories. And then, of course, mapping onto the reality they live in, that is the demographies of other organisms that they're with, and the deeper evolutionary history. So one of the great fascinating things is that both the material ecology and these temporal ecologies all have to come together for an organism to survive. And in the case of humans, that great project, of course, is very much a co-constructed project. And understanding development then really takes us to the heart of unpacking that project. Sorry. So this is what brings us to that eco-biocultural view of human development, where we've got culture in there in terms of the usual beliefs, values, meanings, and cultural models. The culture is informing the behaviors, the perceptions, the ways that people do things in addition to the material worlds and the complete package of settings in which human life goes forward. But from psychological anthropology, there was the insight that we don't grow up in the general culture that we live in. We grow up in a series of tailored niches that is called the developmental niche, that is culturally shaped to interact with the incoming capacities of each child and in the formation of an adult. And that adult person then is not just embodying the culture as a body, but then also as a social being who should ideally be competent to live in that context. And so this is also where the eco comes in, that the ecology has to do with both the formation of the individual and then, of course, continually in terms of the survival and experience of that individual. So this is where I really want to emphasize that eco-biocultural niche, developmental niche, is an envelope. And in fact, we all live in this envelope that has not just physical, but the cognitive, emotional, and social dimensions. And so developmental science is a huge project that occupies much of psychology, but other disciplines as well, to really try to understand human development. One of the challenges of those fields is reflected in this picture, which is that the range of human diversity that is tapped by developmental science actually represents just a narrow range of extant human diversity. And so there is a growing recognition and determination within developmental science to take on more of that diversity. And this, of course, is where anthropology comes in, because we've been trying to do this for a long time. And so part of what the chapter is doing is trying to share what we have learned, because anthropology has definitely had its ups and downs in engaging human diversity. But what we do try to do is to put ourselves in the space where people are and ask, for example, what can we learn from this mother about what it takes for a child to grow up and flourish in the context in which they're living? And furthermore, let's see if this works, we can ask for children as well, what is it that they need in order to flourish in the context in which they'll be living? So what I'm going to do is talk about anthropology's engagement with diversity and deal with some of those ups and downs. Sorry, sometimes the screen lets me advance and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so a little bit of background. For the ethnographic method, which is what anthropology started out using, which was, go away from the comfort of hearth and home to some exotic place, and try to figure out what's going on there. And what developed over the first decades of this project was going beyond bug collecting and looking at exoticism to trying to really seriously engage with the very deep differences that were encountered, and yet we're all human, right? And so some of the presumptions that developed was the notion of unity of mind. That is, we're all different, but somewhere down there we can connect. We are human. We can understand one another. That rested sort of tenuously alongside the notion of cultural relativism, which is that, well, we can be awfully different, and it's not for us to judge because we really don't know the terms on which those differences can be assessed. And this rested alongside with constructivism, which basically asserted that nurture was the primary force in the creation of human diversity, that nature played a little role, but nurture was the big driving force. So as I've mentioned a little bit, the method then was to put skin in the game. That is, the ethnographer was to go out there and do participant observation. Of course, that the effect of being in the space is kind of, in a weak manner, recognized by calling it observant participation. But there were two important things that were not entirely recognized at the time, or it took a while to realize. One was what dislocation really means, what it does to the investigator, and the particular liminal state that the person enters when they do this fieldwork. Because at the beginning, the idea was just to record the context, what's going on, how do people live, what do they do, and the notes and queries for ethnographic encounters, had a long laundry list of that. But increasingly, people were interested in just content. How did people feel? What did this actually mean? What was the quality of people's lives? But in addition to this, there were some unexpected consequences, which was the production of critical insight. What ethnographers began to realize, especially when they came home, was, whoa, there are many ways of doing things. You started getting into reflexivity, where you consider that what you had thought was the natural and good way to do things was not. And so anthropology took that on to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, and to induce a kind of radical doubt for people as a way of gaining distance from the assumed ways of doing things, the naturalized way of doing things, moving us into a space that sort of asks, well, okay, but what differences really make a difference? And of course, then you can get into a infinite spiral of asking, well, who's going to decide what the important difference that a difference makes is going to be? So there's much more that we could say about this project of engaging diversity through fieldwork. But one of the things that I was trying to do with this chapter was for the many parts of the social, not to mention natural sciences, that are not into fieldwork, to really demonstrate the value of fieldwork, not just in terms of understanding others and recording diversity, but that it can have enormous practical and policy implications that can really change how we view things, that have widespread implications. So for that, I took 3 examples from my own work and experience to illustrate these various points. And the first was about breastfeeding and birth spacing. The second one is about the first 1,000 days. And the third one is about warfare and trauma. So to take us to the first case, we go all the way back to the 70s, at which point there was burgeoning concern, not to say moral panic, about exploding population size. That went along at the same time, that went along at the same time with massive public health efforts to improve life expectancy, particularly by focusing on the first 5 years of life, huge nutrition and other interventions, including the introduction of formula and the abandonment of breastfeeding and so forth. At the same time, anthropologists in the Kalahari were working with Kong-san hunter-gatherers to try to understand a lifestyle that had been underrepresented actually in the ethnographic record and yet occupied such a huge portion of human history. They documented all manner of aspects of Kong life, but in the process, the demographers noticed that there was a 4-year interbirth interval that was surprising given that Kong had busy sex lives and no contraception. And at the same time, Mel Connor, who was studying childcare and early child development, noticed that there was a very intense package, a dense package of infant and child care that included very intensive breastfeeding. And at the same time, back in the US and Europe, there was literature coming out showing that there may be neuroendocrine effects of breastfeeding on ovarian function. So we developed a range of field-friendly endocrine methods to try to go back and look at the impact, look at the impact of breastfeeding on ovarian function and whether this could explain some of the interbirth interval. And that's indeed what we found, that the intensive breastfeeding was associated with near complete ovarian suppression for 2 years, just about 2 years postpartum, and then subfertility beyond. So this had, for us, an almost unexpectedly huge effect on global discourse and policy around family planning and particularly around early childcare. Because, of course, one of the big shocks was the recognition that people have long practiced contraception through cultural practices of breastfeeding that can have powerful demographic effects on birth spacing and thence on child survival and maternal health. And so this really helped to rescue breastfeeding from the trash heap of poor practices of childcare that has persisted into the present. There are many reasons why breastfeeding is difficult to sustain increasingly for the first 6 months of life, but that's what some of the policy leaders are still working on. So for our second example, we'll do a fast forward to the early 21st century and the case of the first 1,000 days. So understanding the profound developmental effects of early experience was one of the great accomplishments of late 20th century developmental science, to which some of you probably contributed. These effects begin in gestation and proceed most powerfully in the first 2 years of infancy, and they're propelled in part by the intense pace of neurodevelopment and its sensitivity to context. So this suggested that major gains could be made in the first 1,000 days for improving child developmental outcomes, and through the work of dedicated developmental scientists, really came to inform global policy. So we were working in South Africa and were inspired by this idea to ask, whether interventions during and after pregnancy could enhance child outcomes in challenging environments, such as the massive immigrant communities in the townships around Cape Town. And we were further inspired by the work of Ken Dobbs that had shown that mentor-mother programs, home visiting programs, could really make a difference for mothers under stress. And furthermore, inspired by the work of Ingrid LaRue, who was a local pediatrician working in these townships, who had developed independently a mentor-mother program. And so Mary Jane Rotherham Boris of UCLA, Mark Tomlinson of Stellenbosch, Ingrid and her pediatric clinics, and I took on an RTC to see whether this intervention could really, as I say, could really make a difference. And indeed, as we show in this report and a number of others, it did make a difference for child and maternal outcomes, but not the big difference that we expected it to have. And it required a lot of mentoring and in-home visiting. And so as an anthropologist, that led me to ask, well, wait a minute, have we really asked parents what they think about what makes child development happen and what they should be doing? And what are the local beliefs about that? And so we started working with our staff and other community leaders. We had focus groups to ask about these areas. And one of the big questions that came out was, well, actually, when can parents most influence a child's development? And we then went back into the community with this and a bunch of other questions, and came up using cultural consensus methods with a very surprising outcome. There was strong consensus that the optimal age when parents can really make a difference for their kids was at age 12. And he said, well, okay, why is that? And they enumerated all kinds of challenges for school failure, early pregnancy, drug and other substance use, victimization, involvement in violence and aggression. And we said, well, okay, but you know what about those little guys? What about the little kids here? And they said, oh, well, babies are like weeds. If you provide love and care, which is not trivial, but if you provide love and care, they'll grow. It's really age 12 that matters. Now, this finding had also really important policy effects and scientific effects, because it drew attention to the importance of the second decade, which was starting to be written off by folks who said, great, we'll just take care of the first 1,000 days and then, the rest is, QED. Actually, developmental science was showing there's a whole lot of brain and other development that is going on in the second decade, and our parents were cued into that. Another point is that just because scientists had discovered the importance of first 1,000 days after decades of work, doesn't mean that parents and everybody else got the memo. There's real culture change that might be involved. And so the point here, as with the previous example, is that we would never have seen that without being there, being in situ, looking, listening, engaging with other voices. And so hopefully you're beginning to get the theme of how being there can make a difference. And that takes us to our third and final example, which is the case of ex-child soldiers. I wanted to say that actually I can't claim we caused this, but it helped to propel a move to really pay much more attention to adolescents, to not abandon kids in that second decade. A new journal has come out. Nature had a major special issue And the Center for the Developing Child, that was the force behind the first 1,000 days, has now been complemented by massive funding for the Center for the Developing Adolescent. So now on to our third example around ex-child soldiers and the impact of trauma and dislocation and frank warfare on people, and especially when folks have seen pictures like this, raises huge concerns about what's happening to kids in the midst of conflict. And we encountered this issue in Nepal, where I've worked for over 20 years, mainly with Brandon Court, who many of you likely know, an anthropologist and psychiatrist who's dedicated to his life to working in Nepal and now many other places. Along with the Transcultural Psychosocial Organization and a number of other NGOs and community organizations, as well as just local investigators, both in rural areas, in urban areas and in rural settings. And in the course of this work in 1996, a 10-year civil war broke out. And when it was over in 2006, and the peace accords were being written up, the UNICEF asked us to go back in to assess the impact on children of involvement in and exposure to the traumas of warfare. And this was a controlled study of kids in 5 different districts with both ex-child soldiers and their non-combatant peers. And what we found, unsurprisingly, was that there was a big effect of the degree of exposure to trauma on mental health outcomes for kids, but that there were major modifications depending on gender, caste, and community context. So I'm going to focus on the community context piece because that is the one that has been less attended to. This is that, and I want to thank Lawrence for this photo, which we've included in the book, that the focus on ex-child soldiers can lead to forgetting that those soldiers live in communities and that those communities also have been exposed to trauma and are traumatized. So if we want to heal kids, we need to heal communities. And when we were following up with these kids and doing the original study, we saw this in action, both when we were working in the villages and trying to understand what was going on. We found that the way the kids were treated and the stigma that they were exposed to were particularly important for the outcomes that they had. So it wasn't just the exposure to trauma, but it was how they were treated when they went home. What I'm showing you here is a shaming session, because teachers actually were major vectors of shaming and marginalization of repatriated ex-combatants. And you can see this kid is a little big for his age because he's joined back in the class. He wants to go back to school. And teachers, as thought leaders, had been heavily victimized by both government and Maoist forces during the war. And understandably, they were traumatized. And this got vented on a great fear and negativity focused on the kids. So we developed an intervention with the teachers that actually then helped the teachers, but had a major effect on the kids. And so this, I'm happy to say this message sort of got out in a wider community in terms of really understanding that if you want to help ex-child soldiers, you need to heal communities, not just focus on the kids. And you can see that too, that again, if we hadn't been there and sort of seeing what was going on and listening and trying to understand what was going on, we would not have picked up on this. So what have we learned? What am I trying to say with this, these examples of being there? Well, I'm not trying to say that being there is a substitute for all the other forms of inquiry that we pursue. But seeing, hearing, and engaging in the life worlds of our participants do permit insights, new questions, new understandings that are not otherwise attainable. And so in the chapter, I elaborate on this, so I'll just talk about this briefly. This isn't just about a method, it's also about process, right? This involves engaging local scholars about building human capacity. And the key person I'm showing you here, is Navaraj Upadhyay, whom is training a field team here. And in the years that we've known him, he's gone from a little assistant in the Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, risen through the ranks, gained 2 masters, and is now working on his PhD while being a principal in the TPO. And similarly, Noteba Sia, an AIDS orphan who led the cultural consensus work on parental beliefs that I told you about, was absolutely essential along with all the other staff in the center where we worked. And furthermore, it was South Africans, as I hope you noticed, who initiated both the intervention and provided the human capital and capacity. We just added a little extra. So this also, when I say being there, intersects really nicely with our existential moment, right? Where we're all everywhere and nowhere, where being there has become problematized in a way that it has never been before. And so what I'm going to do in this last part of the discussion is kind of open some of the science that is out there. There's a lot that we could talk about, but I'm just going to focus, because we're talking about mind, brain, and culture, and I haven't talked a lot about brain yet. Some of the fabulous neuroscience and social cognitive work that is being done. And first, to start this, where, as I said at the outset, being there is not an easy matter. But one of the big presumptions that really still needs a lot of unpacking, and we are struggling with enormously, is that notion that we can somehow communicate across difference. And of course, we now recognize that that difference exists within societies, not just across societies. And that was one of the big mistakes of anthropology early on. We were just thinking of societies en masse. But struggling with diversity and how to make oneself understood has been the focus of entire traditions. So I'm just going to give a nod to, sorry guys, this is just, to a tradition like debate in Tibetan Buddhism, where that is the struggle that goes on for years to try to make try to understand and at the same time make oneself understood. But I want to go back to sort of our old roots of thinking about the context in which humans operated for so very long, and the context, therefore, in which our psychosocial capacities were developed. And so let's think about this for a moment, right? So one of the things is humans, we have obligate sociality. We can't survive without other people. And for that, it requires some social competence. But to get that and to maintain it requires the third wheel of what I call the third wheel of evolution and adaptation, and that is information. We absolutely have to have information, and our brains are a giant adaptation for that important fact. And related to that is the need for connection. And so I think as we all work through this process of reimagining how we study human diversity, how we engage it, and how we work with it, thinking about the determinants of information access and quality. This is where marginalization, social structure, access to information really become important ways in which all the culture stuff really determines who gets access to information and how good it is. And at the same time, humans have a massive drive, we must have a massive drive to try to understand, or at least good enough understanding of what's going on, and to be comprehensible, to make the world comprehensible to ourselves and ourselves to others. And so I'm going to go through a bit of, looking at our time, go through a bit of the recent social neuroscience that speaks directly to some of these issues. So the first of these, and I'm starting with this because it also leads back to our notion of being there in the old sense of the ethnographic method, that actually face-to-face social encounters, or at least encounters where we believe we are operating with another social being, are engage the brain significantly differently. And so what I'm showing you here is just, you probably know that the brain is organized in all kinds of ways, but partly is flexibly using networks that neuroscientists are frantically trying to get a hold of. Current terms are like the mentalizing network, where we try to really make sense of things. Related to that in terms of social cognition is the mirror neuron network, where we're imagining, literally representing what's going on with others. And then the reward networks that drive us to do these things and tell us, make us feel good or bad. And I'll show you a bit about that in a bit, depending on how we're doing socially. So what this is showing you on the left, this in a context where you're doing, participants are in the scanner. They're looking at an interaction, and up here they're told to try to figure out what the interactants are thinking and intending to do. And showing you the pattern that the mentalizing network is activated in those conditions. If they're just observing and not prompted to attend to the intentions of the individuals, that mentalizing network, at least in this study, was not activated. However, when people believe that they're interacting with a true social other that is behaving in a contingent manner, that mentalizing network is activated whether or not they're told to be paying attention, right? So we're paying attention if we think, and this is just the mentalizing network, but we're paying attention in a different way when we think we're interacting with another person. And it goes deeper than that, right? That the attending is also tuning brain activity. And here's a nice study that came before remote learning and all the debates about being in or outside the classroom. This is a bunch of high school seniors, put EEGs on them and looked at levels of attention and engagement, and found that when the kids who were and when they were engaged in whatever was going on, showed synchrony in patterns of brain activity, whereas when they were not, they did not show that synchrony. And this was really exciting because we know that simulation is a huge way in which our brain operates, right? We're doing this all the time. It's how we plan to do things. It's how we think about the future. It's how we remember the past. It's how we organize what we're going to say, like what I'm doing right now. It's how we do empathy. We simulate, that's the mirror neuron network and others, how we simulate what's going on. And it's about shared attention. So the social contexts are important ways, especially when repeated through time, potentially, which we can come to have shared embodied spaces. And here I'm just going to flag some really nifty work I'm sure a lot of you know about Yuri Hassan and his colleagues who've been doing lovely stuff on social cognition. And so among the many things that they found is that if you show people movies and you do hyperscanning, so you've got pairs of people in the scanner at the same time and they're looking at the same movie. So they're not in the same space, but they're looking at the same movie. If they recall that movie, if they have if they narrate the movie in a similar way, that is, if they interpreted the movie in a similar manner, their brain waves while viewing the movie were more likely to be similar. And furthermore, their encoding of and the brain patterns while they were remembering the movie were more likely to be similar. And that this effect held whether that you viewed a movie or just heard the narrative. So this is really cool because I believe in campfire gossip, and there's been a lot of great stuff around that, which is humans learn enormous amounts vicariously. Again, often embedded in a social context, but anyway, I think this is really important and interesting. The other thing was this other finding by Hassan's group, which is that when people share different values and beliefs and interpret the movie differently or other experiences and narratives differently, they both recall the scene or the narrative differently. They do not show the same brain activation patterns. And the residue then of that experience is ingrained differently, right? So this can also lead to what Bateson called schismogenesis, where you get repeated patterns, where you build up differences, where people occupy what appear to be the same social spaces, but actually live in the same social places, but actually live in very different spaces. And then this also brings us to the dark side of cooperation and what we love to talk about, empathy. And we've got great stuff in the book about that. What we're not so strong on representing were the powerful forces, and that includes neuroendocrine and endocrine forces that humans and cognitive forces that humans have for deciding who's in, who's out, who's us, who's them. And there's a very large literature that can cue us in to what the important bases for empathy are. So familiarity, similarity, learning, past experience, salience. You can see how Hassan's work speaks directly to this other work that is telling us that, yeah, humans are capable of empathy, but not equally capable to the same degree all the time. And lastly, go to work by Susan Fisk, started about 20 years ago, and others, where we're so focused on brain activation patterns, we actually don't look at the flip side, which is brain deactivation patterns. And early on, Susan showed that when people were exposed to pictures of homeless or crazy people or disgusting images, that their brains deactivated. And this is fabulous work by an ex-student of hers who we did a study, so this is people in the scanner who are playing a game where they are acting as the owners of a sports team. And they bid on and own players, and they have pictures of the players, and they put teams together. And when they're shown pictures of the persons they own compared to the persons they don't own, what you get is a deactivation, relative deactivation of these social tuning in networks. I'm speaking very generally here. And so we've got lots of evidence and plenty of paradigms to really help us start to work on in a new and creative, but also urgent way to understand human difference. Because here's the kicker, right? We're not only very sensitive in how we behave toward others, but we are also acutely tuned in to what happens when you're marginalized, what happens when you feel on the outside, what will we do to be on the inside? And Nancy Eisenberger started work in this area. There are lots of complications around this, so I don't want to oversimplify. But we do know that pain has two components, and that actually the sensory pain, so this is, somatosensory and as well as the posterior insula, that's one representation, but that affective pain is actually the dorsal cingulate and the anterior insula, and that these, Nancy found, and again, there are lots of wrinkles on this, but that these areas in, again, a game imaging situation where you look at an exclusion over inclusion or non-exclusion, that these same areas are activated. So in other words, what motivates us, and by the way, that takes us back to my ethnographer, what motivates us when we're cast in a situation where we don't know what's going on? It's a profound social pain, a profound need to learn, to understand. And that can be very motivating, but it can also be rather paralyzing. So I'll end by just saying, being there started out as a way for me to have a conversation about human ecology, human development, how the ethnographic presence, being with people, could really make a difference for understanding and raising new questions related to human welfare. But that it also brings us to our immediate moment of how we engage across human difference. And it's a work in progress. Thanks. Oh, and thank you for being there.
There is here and here is there. Thank you so much, Carol, for that very rich